Hello and welcome back. Now I have something a little bit different for you today. I hope you're going to like it. This is actually a short story that I wrote that was based on a dream I had. I dreamed it over 20 years ago. I can remember just waking up and having one of those really vivid dreams. And it was like a story. It was like I'd been inside a story. And I quickly had a book by my bed, which was lucky, and I wrote down the gist of the story. And over the next few days, I kind of fleshed it out because I had some time to just work on that. And I was a would-be budding writer at the time, and I was fleshing out this story, and I thought it would make an excellent short story. Then I put it in a drawer, and life kept me busy for many, many years. It was actually only, I think, last year that I decided I would finish that story, and I went back and it almost wrote itself. It was just all there. It was as vivid, as it had been the first night I dreamed it. And I don't think I wrote this story. I think it came from somewhere. Maybe it's the place in the astral planes or the spiritual realms where plots and storylines come from, and there's some kind of hidden message in there for people. It is a kind of spiritual story, so I think you might enjoy it. And somebody once said to me, I had this as an article, I had it written out and available to share with people, and they said, blimey, that must have been some dream. Must have been a really long dream. Well, it wasn't. I didn't dream this story as you're about to hear it now. I just dreamed the kind of highlights, like a movie trailer. It was just a kind of summary of that story, and it's only when I sat down and fleshed it out that the finished article as it is right now came to be. So I'm going to read this, and I'm going to be reading and not flashing back to you because I don't want to interrupt the cadence of this story. I wanted to have the rhythm and give it, let it flow as it was written. And I really hope you enjoy it, just for the sake of itself. Just get a cup of tea or a coffee and put your feet up and enjoy this little spiritual story. Hope you like it. It's called Forgotten. His leg ached again, and he massaged the muscle and sighed. He longed to feel like he used to. He thought back to when he could run for miles and barely be out of breath. Had it really been 6 months since the accident? It had been a rough time for him. They said he was almost dead when they found him, in a coma for a month, but he'd no memory of that. In fact, he'd no memory of the crash at all, which was a blessing really, as the car had been a write-off. After that came the long, slow weeks of recovery and physio. And looking at himself in the mirror now, he saw the face of a stranger. His skin was so pale, and he'd lost a lot of weight. He sighed again. It was time. He needed to shake off this melancholy and pick up the pieces of his life. That was why he decided to come up here to the cabin and get away from all the family fussing around him. Honestly, his mother acted like he was 5 years old instead of 25. She'd wanted to come with him. She'd been quite insistent and gotten really very angry with him in the end, but he'd been adamant. He wanted to be alone. He had to get away, to find some space to think about what to do next with his life. His leg was fine. The hospital had discharged him with instructions to take it easy, and that is just what he intended to do. He opened the bedroom window and he looked out at the forest of trees as far as the eye could see. The sun was rising now, and he could feel its warmth on his face. There was a soft breeze which carried the scents of the forest to him. Yes, he needed to get out of the house, and a gentle walk would help him build back some strength in his leg. He grabbed a light jacket from the rail as he unlocked the front door and stepped outside and breathed in the woodland scents deeply. He was really looking forward to spending some time in nature. He'd been planning this for weeks, and he felt relieved he was here at last. He decided not to take lunch with him. After all, he was only planning a short walk today. As he grew stronger, he knew he could happily disappear into the mountains all day, and not overnight like he used, and if not overnight like he used to as a teenager. Thinking of those happy, carefree days made him smile, and it struck him he'd not smiled very much lately. He couldn't explain it, but ever since the accident, it was as if he'd lost the ability to be happy. Physically, he was in pretty good shape, just the odd ache in his leg and the tiredness, which often took him by surprise. But mentally, he was not fully recovered. He just felt very down all the time. Before the accident, laughter and smiles came easily to him. It was as if he'd broken something inside of himself, but didn't know how to fix it, or even what it was that was broken. He shook his head. He knew he needed to give himself time. The birds were singing all around him, and they seemed to help lift his mood for a time as he walked along the familiar pathways. The ground underfoot was soft and slightly damp, and he knew his way without thinking as his steps took him deep into the forest. He was going towards the woodland clearing with the fallen oak. It was a favourite walk of his as a child. The old forest opened up there. It was a place full of magic and mystery, where he'd spent many happy days, looking for fairy houses, exploring nature, and playing with the woodland creatures. Time seemed to pass very quickly there, and he was always getting into trouble for being gone so long when he finally made his way back to the cabin. He was almost there now, and his steps had gotten faster, but as he approached the clearing, he slowed down and then stopped. There was a strange noise. He could hear someone up ahead. It sounded as if they were crying. He quietly approached the clearing, and he could just make out the figure of a young woman. She was sitting on the fallen oak tree, and she was sobbing. He didn't know what to do. Should he quietly turn around and leave her alone, or should he see if he could help her? He decided to carry on because the sobs were getting louder now, and she was clearly very upset. He was not sure what he could do, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Slowly and gently, he approached the woman. She saw him coming and looked up at him. She was leaning forward with her head in her hands, and as he came closer, she tried to stop crying. She raised her eyes to him as more tears flowed. She could not speak. She was distraught. She gazed at him, and he felt her grief, a sadness which eclipsed his own melancholy. What could have happened to this beautiful young woman to make her so distressed? He nodded his head towards the space next to her on the fallen tree, as if to ask her permission to sit next to her, and she seemed to blink her agreement. Fresh sobs came as he sat down. He gazed at the woman, and he was struck by how attractive she was. Even with her red-rimmed eyes and runny nose, she was stunningly beautiful, and he wanted to take away her pain. He reached out and laid a hand gently on her shoulder, and she turned to look at him with such longing in her eyes and such deep, deep sadness. It broke his heart to see her pain. And then she spoke at last. "Tom," she said softly. He was shocked. How could this beautiful stranger know his name? He couldn't speak. He was so lost in his thoughts. He searched his memory for who she might be, but he knew they'd never met before. He would have remembered her. "Tom," she said again. pleading with her eyes as she looked deeply into his, fresh tears falling as she spoke. He stared at her. Something odd was happening. His head ached suddenly. He had this lump in his chest, this tight, painful lump, and she reached out and held his hand and squeezed it tightly as she searched his face for something. He felt numb, torn between wanting to gaze into her eyes and wanting to tear his hand away from her and to get up and run. Something very wrong was happening here. Something was making his heart race. He could hear it beating loudly in his ears. He felt overwhelmed with emotion. He felt this woman's pain. He became aware that he was crying. Gentle tears escaped from the corner of his eyes as he felt wave after wave of such sadness overwhelm him. He wanted to let go. He wanted to push her away. But at the same time, he wanted to never let go. And he wanted to crush her to him and hold her till the end of time. What was happening to him? All this time she held his gaze. She looked deeply into his eyes, and she seemed to be begging him to forgive her. Forgive her for what? Who was this woman? Why was she so familiar to him? What did she want from him? And then, as if the clouds suddenly began to clear, he felt something shift inside him. Something very subtle changed, and he felt a familiar ache inside him, and the ache grew into an unbearable pain, and he began to sob loudly, and all the while she watched him and held his hand, and her eyes pleaded with him to forgive. And then it happened. There was a tearing inside him, and so much pain, he thought he would die from it. She'd stopped crying now. She was watching him. Her brow was furrowed, and her hand still firmly holding his. He seemed to fall apart. The ache inside him had grown so powerful that he could not speak. The tears flowed. He sobbed and his shoulders shook as he fought to make sense of the whirling thoughts in his mind. And he looked at her now, and he finally remembered who she was. "Jen?" he whispered to her, and she gently nodded her head. She smiled a strange sort of broken smile. Her eyes were no longer crying, and instead they seemed to shine like bright pools. He said her name again, and there was a question in his voice, and without him ever speaking the words, she knew what the question was. And she gently shook her head and reached over to hug him to her. His arms came around her, and he held her so tightly, as if just by the sheer strength of his love, he could keep her there. For one beautiful moment, they shared a kiss with such passion, such emotion, such longing. It was as if the whole forest held its breath. Then ever so slowly, she began to fade. He could still feel her arms around him and the warmth of her body. The memory of her kiss was on his lips, and still she became lighter and lighter till he could barely see her there. His skin felt gentle tingling all over where their bodies had touched, but she was gone. And suddenly he understood. He knew why she had to come and why she had to go. He remembered everything now. How they met, fell in love, made a life together, and then the pain of losing her in the car accident. He remembered wanting to die with her. He remembered feeling the overwhelming grief and loss, so powerful it left him gasping for air. He saw clearly now. His mind had completely erased his memories of her. He was angry that his family and friends had kept this from him as he recovered. No one had spoken of her in all those long months. Even as time passed and his body began to heal and grow strong again, his mind had kept all traces of her locked away. And he felt all that pain now, as raw as it had felt on the day of the accident. It was a terrible kind of grief, and it tore at his heart. He missed her so much. He hugged his arms to his chest, and he let the tears flow freely as he sobbed her name over and over. He was sitting on the fallen tree, all alone in the clearing. He knew now that it was his heart that was broken, as so many memories came flooding back, happy ones along with the sad, and he seemed to be laughing and crying at the same time. She had come back to help him, to set him free. He understood. Still seeing her beautiful face and feeling the faintest memory of their last embrace, he turned and looked around the clearing. Goodbye, Jen. I love you. Always will, he whispered to the silence as he turned and began the long walk back to the cabin. The end. Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And I hope in a funny way it spoke to you and it reminded you to go away and hug all the people you love in your life. I think the message behind that story is one which is designed to open up your heart chakra and allow love in and love out. And I'm not going to speak too much at the end of that. I'm just going to leave that feeling and that emotion there for you to marinate around your body. And I wish you all the very, very best. And I'll speak to you again soon. God bless.